This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you, Minty. And thank you to everyone for being here today. My research is about change processes and opportunities for crop diversification in Eastern India. And I'm excited for this opportunity to share with all of you a little bit about the work that I've done so far on this topic and my plans for future research. So diversification is a hot topic globally. You can see from this graph that the number of journal articles published with the term crop diversification has increased drastically over the last couple of decades. And the interest in crop diversification really stems from its potential to address several of the most pressing problems we have today. And those are, first, improving agronomic and environmental outcomes, then improving farmers' incomes, thereby reducing poverty, and finally, improving nutritional stability. There's also a lot of interest in crop diversification in India, with reference to a lot of the same potential outcomes. So economic welfare, nutritional outcomes, improving resilience to climate shocks, and even reducing carbon footprint and energy consumption. But even though everyone is researching crop diversity under this banner, of crop diversification, the definitions of crop diversification vary pretty drastically, from diversifying the crop mix to replacing current crops with new crops. And this latter definition is especially common in Indian literature and Indian development literature also, and typically refers to replacing current crops with high value crops. So these very varied understandings of crop diversity make it difficult to ascribe functional value to diversification, which brings me to the initial question driving this research. What types of diversification make sense for what types of farmers, in what contexts, and with what outcomes? So far I've been exploring these questions in the context of Bihar, which is a state in Eastern India in the Indo-Gangetic Plains. And I argue that this is a good location for me to continue this research for several reasons. One, Bihar is facing several problems that crop diversification may help to address. There's extremely high rates of poverty and malnutrition in Bihar, and there's also frequency of droughts and floods, increasing frequency of droughts and floods. There's also potential for high impact of crop diversification as an avenue for improving development outcomes in Bihar, because there's a large portion of the population that depends on agriculture for their incomes. And there's also, the cropping system is mainly rice and wheat, so there's a lot of opportunity for diversifying to different crops. But there's also opportunity for researching diversification there because of pockets of diversity and also changes over time that are interesting to look at. There's also interest amongst government and NGO community in Bihar. And last but not least, we have research connections there. So CISA, which is the Cereal Systems Initiative for South Asia, is a program that Andy has been involved with for many years, and they're based in Bihar. So we have some strong research support there. So the first project I took on in this domain was to start digging into why the spatial diversity, or what can explain spatial diversity between farms in Bihar. And so to do this, I used the National Sample Survey from 2012-2013, which surveyed 35,000 farmers across all of India. And it went to each of these households twice, once in the Kharif or monsoon season, and once in the Rabi or dry season. And I focused for this analysis on the Rabi season because there's more diversification in the Rabi season compared to the Kharif season in Bihar. And the measure that I used for diversity was the Simpson Diversity Index, which measures both the number of crops and how evenly area is distributed between crops. And it's an index on a scale of 0 to 1. So 0 is no diversity, there's only one crop grown. And as it approaches 1, the diversity is increasing. And looking at the data from this national sample survey in Bihar, a lot of the farmers are just growing one crop in the rabi season. Oh, whoops. Anyways, I don't know how to. Oh, there. And so because of that distribution, I decided to split my analysis into a logistic regression and a linear regression. First looking at why are some farmers planting more than one crop, and then looking at of those farmers who are planting more than one crop, what is their diversity index? And I had some interesting findings. First, I found that larger farm size is associated with growing more than one rabi crop, but not with greater diversity indices. Second, I found that growing more than one crop and higher diversity indices are both associated with growing the higher value crops or non-cereals. Third, I found that households who are more dependent on agriculture tend to grow more than one rabi crop. In addition to this, I looked at several other factors at the household level, which I've listed at the bottom of the slide here, which didn't turn out to be significant in this analysis. But importantly, there are also factors above the household level, which were significant, including a village effect. So households that are in a village where other farmers are more diverse also tend to be more diverse themselves. The second piece of preliminary work I'd like to tell you about today is comes from key informant interviews that I conducted in Bihar this past summer. And I'm not going to walk through each of these maps, but I just wanted to show you that I created all these maps of diversity patterns and trends last spring, and I used them to guide conversations with key informants over the summer. So just to give you one example of how those conversations went, on the left here are maps that I made with the National Sample Survey household level data, and it's household level crop diversity averaged at the district level. And so the top one is 2018 data, and the bottom one is the change from 2012 to 2018 in household level diversity. And then I've outlined in red where the patterns that I saw in my maps did not match what I learned from my key informants. And then I have outlined in yellow where what I was learning from key informants did kind of make sense with the maps that I made. And so with these maps, and as well as with other maps of TESOL level diversity and district level diversity that I discussed with key informants, some trends match and some trends don't. But what the conversation always kept coming back to was what crops are behind these patterns and these trends. And so I came away feeling like diversity index may not be the best way of understanding cropping system distributions and changes in Bihar. Maybe looking at the actual crops is more relevant. The final piece of preliminary work that I'd like to share with you is comes from focus group discussions that I had with farmers in Bihar, digging into trying to understand their decision-making about their cropping systems. So this slide summarizes focus groups that I had in Begusarai, which is a district in central Bihar. And just for an example, looking at the Kharif season, 10 or so years ago, farmers were transitioning from rice and maize to soybean. And the reasons they gave for that were rain was decreasing, soybean is more tolerant to drought, soybean is bringing more profit. They had to invest less in fertilizer, they weren't fertilizing soybeans, so they were getting more profit than with maize. And they also mentioned the processing being easier with soybean compared to maize. And then coming to some more current trends, fall armyworm is a new pest that they're dealing with in corn. So they're shifting what area they have left in corn more towards soybean now. And then they talked about electric irrigation as something that is planned to come into their area. And they said that if electric irrigation does come, then they would be interested in switching from soybean back to rice, actually, because it's a more assured crop. So some take-home points from this preliminary work. First, from the regression analysis, that factors at multiple scales are influencing diversity at the farm level. So land size and market orientation and livelihood structure are important at the household level, but there's also factors above the household level that we have to take into account, for any analysis. And then from key informant interviews, I learned that maps of diversity index are not particularly useful without information about the specific crops that are behind those patterns and those trends. And then from farmer interviews, I learned that farmers are not thinking in terms of diversification. They're just thinking in terms of what crops to grow this year, given the current constraints and opportunities. And the major factors influencing their decisions are irrigation, pests, labor, and profit. So now getting into my proposal for my dissertation research. What I would like my research to be able to do is to inform development programming that promotes crop diversification that fits the local context. And I'm being purposely vague here in using the term diversification, allowing it to encompass different transitions for different contexts. And so the way I see it, the problem is that in the literature, this focus on concepts of diversity and diversification are too messy for understanding change processes, decision processes, and outcomes. So my proposed solution is to conduct research that really gets at how and why cropping patterns are changing, how farmers are making decisions about cropping systems, and where changing the cropping pattern can result in improved agronomic outcomes. So following that, I'll read you my research questions. The first is, how have cropping patterns in Bihar changed over time? And what were the regional scale drivers of those changes? The second, what types of cropping patterns are farmers following? What factors at the household level and beyond are associated with those different patterns? What are the outcomes? And how do farmers decide which pattern to follow? And finally, when and where can diversification out of puddled rice improve the water use efficiency of wheat? So I'm going to talk through each of these questions a little more and along with my planned methods. So for the first question, how have cropping patterns in Bihar changed over time, and what were the regional scale drivers for those changes? My first action item is to create maps of district level crop areas. And I'll do that using Department of Agriculture data. And you can see they'll look something like what I already have here on the right. The second point is to identify large-scale trends, either by visually comparing the maps. For example, you can see some trends here. So the wheat is the dark blue. The light blue is maize. If you focus on maize in the northeast region of Bihar, comparing the 2 years, you can see that the area under maize has increased. So some trends can be seen visually, but in order to create a more formalized groupings of cropping system trends, I will use k-means for late in class analysis to create clusters based on cropping trends. Then I will show these maps and clusters to key informants, so people from government, NGOs, market aggregators, et cetera, and probe about the drivers behind these trends. And finally, I will conduct case studies looking at maize and pulses. So as I mentioned, the maize area has increased in the Northeast. And this will provide an interesting example of a case where a market crop has really come into a region in a big way. Then I'll look at the pulse story, which is a little more complicated. So if you look at the southwest corner here, and again, wheat is the dark blue, but basically everything that's not dark blue here are pulses. And you can see that they've decreased in this time period, but they're still there, they're still persisting. And so this is another interesting story to look into, because pulses are an important crop for nutrition and soil health and are also valued highly by the government. So it's another change process that I'd like to look at. My second question, what types of cropping patterns are farmers following? What factors at the household level and beyond influence those patterns? What are the outcomes, and how do farmers make decisions about what pattern to follow? So first, I'm going to use the data from the NSS to create clusters of households with similar cropping patterns. So on the right is a map that shows the great variety of cropping patterns that exist in Bihar. And you can see the blue is rice wheat. I don't expect you to be able to read this, but I just wanted you to see that there's a great diversity of different cropping patterns followed. But I will need to, again, use that clustering approach to reduce these cropping systems into a manageable number of groups that I can analyze. And once I have those groups, then I'll conduct a multivariate logistic regression with cluster as the outcome and looking at various household, village, and district level predictor variables. And so that will include things like I saw were important, like land size and market orientation, irrigation, and then zooming out and looking at agroecological, agroclimatic factors like drainage and rainfall, et cetera. And then I'll run some regressions to look at outcomes using the data from the NSS. There are a few outcomes we can look at. One is income. We can also look at the share of produce that was sold at a satisfactory price, consumer expenditure, and financial assets. And finally, I'll conduct a case study in a district where there's a lot of variation. For example, I'm thinking Begusarai, the central district. There's a lot of variation of cropping systems there. And so this case study will seek to understand why farmers are in a district where it is clearly possible to follow these different cropping systems. How are farmers deciding between these systems? And so finally, my last question, how much can diversification improve agronomic resilience to climate change? Specifically, when and where can diversification out of puddled rice improve the water use efficiency of wheat? So irrigation is common in Bihar, but it's still the main limiting factor to yield. And this is because irrigation relies on energy that's expensive and polluting, and it's becoming even more of a limiting factor with terminal heat stress that is more of a problem with wheat in recent years. So there's interest in better managing green water productivity. And one solution could be reestablishing natural capital like soil physical quality by diversifying out of puddled rice, which we know is very destructive to soil structure. So, but how much can diversifying out of puddled rice improve the water use efficiency of the subsequent wheat crop? And how does that vary depending on soil type, wheat planting time, et cetera? So to answer these questions, I plan to conduct some on-farm experiments. I'll select farms with puddled rice, direct seeded rice, and maize, and stratify by soil type or drainage class and wheat planting time. Then we'll apply some irrigation treatments. The outcome of interest will be wheat growth per unit water, and we'll also measure soil hardness and temperature at maturity, as those will influence the outcome that we're interested in. And yeah, and then finally, I'm going to address the last part of this question. It'll be a modeling exercise, probably working with modeling software like Axim. And I'll use the results from the on-farm experiments to create a model that predicts where diversification out of puddled rice will improve the water use efficiency and climate resilience of wheat. With that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and thank you to all these people for helping me produce this research to this point. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
I think it's really cool here. I had a question about the models. When you have all the survey data and you're looking for predictors, are you basing the ones you choose on like interviews and personal or like knowledge, or like starting with all those variables and doing some sort of model selection?
So I'm limited by the variables that exist in the NSS data. So I'm kind of taking the instead of doing qualitative first and using that to inform the quantitative part of my research, I'm doing it the opposite way. So I'm doing quantitative analysis of the data and then using the results from that to inform my qualitative research and interviews that I'll be designing. Like I'll be designing interview guides in January and going to India in February. So, yeah.
So if part of what would help or make it more diverse is you could move a little bit away from wheat. Wheat looks like the dominant thing. Mm-hmm. And there with what's happening in Ukraine, that's where they grow a lot of wheat. So then wheat prices go up, like the timing of when you had done the surveys and the models already, is that built in already, or can you factor that in, that there's this much potential for diversification if wheat price is X, and if it goes up to Y, we're sort of stuck there?
That's a good question. So the question is about wheat prices.
Yeah, just, and I maybe you're not even going to try to project like what's the potential for diversification, but if you are, it seems like the things like that, and you can't predict it, how long the war is going to go on.
Right. Yeah. You'll have to come back with that question.
Sorry, maybe it's way beyond the scope of it.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Kiera? I think we're at time, Tony.
Oh, just a quick question. I noticed in one of your early slides that elevation was an important factor in cross diversity. Can you say a little bit about that? Why would that be? Were you surprised?
Yeah. We were with that, especially since like Bihar is pretty flat. It doesn't vary a whole lot in elevation, but so we think it might be a proxy for something else, like drainage is really the main thing that's driving.
Thanks a lot, Kiera.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.